Hola, buenos días. La charla que sigue, como nos dijo Vanessa, va a estar a cargo del doctor Bruce Patterson, y para mí es un verdadero honor poder presentarla. Bruce es curador de mamíferos en el 𝐞-𝐣𝐚𝐦 Natural History de Chicago y un estudioso de la diversificación, distribución e historia natural de los mamíferos. Con el tiempo, su amplitud taxonómica y sus intereses geográficos lo han llevado desde América del Sur hasta África, enfocando sus trabajos en roedores, murciélagos y grandes gatos, o como dice Bruce, rats, bats and cats. En América del Sur, Bruce ha colaborado con científicos y estudiantes en Colombia, Ecuador, Perú, Bolivia, Brasil, Argentina y Chile, y ha trabajado en los Andes, la Amazonía y los bosques atlántico, valdiviano y magellánico. Ha descrito con regularidad numerosas especies nuevas de murciélagos, roedores y marsupiales. En su ponencia de hoy, Bruce nos hablará de su programa de investigación centrado en la historia de los leones de Tsavo, mundialmente reconocidos como devoradores de hombre hace un siglo y que incluso ha dado lugar a varias adaptaciones cinematográficas. Sin más que agregar, los dejo entonces que disfruten de la charla de Bruce.
The European colonization of Africa took place long after Europeans colonized South America, so it was at the end of the 19th century that the British began their colonization of what at the time was called British East Africa, and we now know as Kenya. Their goal was to build a railroad. And let's see if I can get a mouse present. To build a railroad from the Indian Ocean port town of Mombasa to the Great Lakes of Africa, and thereby protect the source of the Nile and their dominion over the northern part of Africa. They were also in a race with Germans in what is now Tanzania. The Germans were also building a railroad and were bent on the expansion of their empire. At this time, the British had no foothold at all in East Africa. And so their railroad had to supply itself. And this meant that they would bring crews from the coast, they would lay track, they would then at camps nearby have to be resupplied continuously from the coast. And this was very slow going. Next slide. Next, Pablo. Up, back. Yeah. So this is about 200 kilometers inland. They had to cross the Tsavo River. And here's the bridge that they built as you can see it today. But it was obviously a very different environment 120 years ago when this construction was taking place. Colonel Patterson, who is no relation of mine, but is a central player in this story, arrived in East Africa in March of 1898. His job was to build the permanent railroad fixtures in a 30-mile radius around the Tsavo River. That included the stone foundations for the bridge, as well as all of the stations and buildings that were needed to supply the railroad. He had a crew of perhaps 3,000 men gathered there, stonemasons, laborers, cooks, various sorts of folks, strung in a big unwieldy camp along the length of the railroad. And it was within a week of Patterson's arrival in Tsavo that the first man-eating event took place. Two men disappeared. They were found eaten outside camp, their remains. Patterson at the time assumed that they were scoundrels who had murdered each other and had been scavenged by animals. But he was proved wrong very soon afterwards when his foreman, a fellow named 𝐸𝐸 Singh, was dragged from his tent in the middle of the night. A lion entered the tent, seized him by the head, dragged him kicking and screaming out of the tent into the bush, his heels making furrows in the sand as the lion began to eat him alive. The next day, they went out and recovered his remains, and all that was left of him was a head with a frozen, horrified expression frozen on his face. And Patterson resolved at that time that he would bring the lions to account. This went on month after month. More men would disappear. Obviously, people were, the workers there were nervous and frightened. They built, as you can see in this middle figure on the bottom, they built big thorn enclosures around their tents in an effort to keep the lions at bay, but with little success. And each night Patterson would go out, set up a shooting platform somewhere in camp, and would hear the screams and cries of men being attacked by lions on the other side of camp. No matter where he went, he was always in the wrong place. When in the fall, 2 lions began entering and attacking camp in partnerships, all pandemonium broke loose and men massively deserted. And this figure on the bottom right shows all of the workers hopping the train back to the coast, leaving Patterson and a few people left in the camp. And it was in the wake of this that he finally succeeded in killing the lions. Next slide. So it took 9 months. In December, early December 1898, Patterson was able to kill the first man-eater. 3 weeks later, he was able to kill the second one. And he sat down and wrote 10 years later what became, next slide, that one, yes. He wrote a book called The Man-Eaters of Zavo and Other East African Adventures that was published in 1907 and is still in print today. It's a bestseller. And it's given rise to at least 3 feature-length movies. Wanna Devil came out in the 1950s, The Ghost in the Darkness, Val Kilmer and Michael Douglas came out in 1996. And then an Indian feature based largely on this story. And alongside these movies, there are hundreds or thousands of articles and books have been written about the Zavo lions. Each of those authors and producers and directors took literary license with the facts of the story. Many conjectures were made about the circumstances of the lion attacks and so on. And it became sort of a goal of mine to try and separate fact from fiction in the story and to see what actually took place. The truth had to be at the intersection of all of these views and stories that had been told. Next slide. So Colonel Patterson became a minor figure on the natural history circuit and was in Chicago in November 1924. He gave a talk at the museum shortly after we opened the building the museum's currently in, which had a lot more room than it has now after a century of collecting. And Patterson, the museum's president, said, "Whatever happened to the lions themselves?" And Patterson said, "Why, they're trophy rugs in my house in Ivor, England." And you can see on the left side of this, Patterson's wife sitting on top of the 2 man-eating lions of Zavo, plus a leopard that is not part of this story. A month later, the museum's president had met Patterson's asking price of $5,000 for the lions. The lions within months were mounted into lifelike poses and incorporated in a diorama. And these lions have been on exhibit here ever since and have been one of the great attractions. And of course, the ending of the movie, The Ghost in Darkness, was a big shot in the arm because the narrator says, if you want to see these lions, you have to go to the Field Museum in Chicago. And a lot of people did, which is good for the museum. But sort of the heart of the story I'm trying to tell you today is that the lions, because we have the skins and skulls of the lions, they offer independent testimony on the events that took place in Tsavo. And as I hope to convince you, we can actually get to the heart of the matter by following scientific leads using these imperfect but important specimens. Next slide. So the organization of the talk that I'll give you, I've worked on sort of the field ecology of lions, and especially the subject of manelessness and lion depredations on livestock. And I'm happy to talk about those things, but I'll focus the talk today on what drove the lions to attack and kill humans. Why were they man-eaters? Is there evidence for environmental triggers for man-eating in Tsavo? And how many people did the lions actually eat? And the specimens offer us insights on all of these questions. Next slide. Well, it goes without saying that lions live violent lives, and this is clearly reflected in the condition of their teeth. The figure on the lower left shows a lion that lost a lower right canine in an attack on a giraffe. You can imagine the incredible force it would take to unroot such a massive tooth from a mandible like this. But the pictures on the right show 4 lions in the collections of the Field Museum. This is what happens to lions' teeth over the course of 8 or 9 or 10 years of life. Incisors get worn down from stripping hide off of carcasses. Canines are broken, worn down. Invariably, the pulp cavity is exposed. After canines, which are the most frequently damaged teeth, the carnassial is often cracked or broken because lions will go after bones in order to get at the marrow. So lions typically have broken teeth if they live to full maturity. And the next slide, the lions of Tsavo were no exceptions to this. Next, yeah. So these are all shots of the first man-eater, 23970 Field Museum. And what you can see on the lower right canine is broken, and there's a large gaping hole in it. Now, Colonel Patterson thought that that hole was the bore of the bullet, that one of the bullets that killed the lion. But an anatomist would clearly identify that as the pulp cavity of the canine tooth. That's where the nerves and blood vessels that nurture the living tooth ordinarily reside. The fact that it wasn't created yesterday is attested to by the smooth rounded edges. So this has obviously been worn since the tooth was broken. Next to the broken canine, we're missing 3 incisor teeth. Their sockets are actually filled with spongy bone in a repair mechanism. So that this is obviously an injury that's taken some time to repair. In the absence of those lower right incisors, the upper incisors have super erupted, so they actually extend further ventrally than they do on the intact side of the mouth. Finally, as you can see on the left side of the lion, in an intact dentition, the upper canine is blocked behind and to the outside of the lower canine. But in the absence of the lower right canine, the upper canine has shifted forward and inward so that its tip is resting on the stump of the broken tooth rather than extending several centimeters beyond it, as in the left side. So all of this is to say that this lion probably sustained the kick of a zebra or giraffe that broke its tooth, and 2 or 3 years had transpired in which all of these cranial remodeling events had altered the physiognomy of the cat. But it wasn't until Skip Nyberger and I put this, this jaw under an X-ray that we detected what was probably essential in the behavior of this cat, and that is a periapical abscess, a root tip abscess. Disease had developed, and this abscess would have made excruciatingly painful any pressure placed on the canine tooth. Now, as most mammalogists know, big cats seize and hold large struggling prey with their canine teeth, and it's a very powerful grip, and it needs to be powerful in order to hold this large struggling prey in position. And without the ability to apply that kind of pressure, this cat would have been severely disadvantaged in attacking zebra, buffalo, giraffe, other large struggling prey. Next slide. This general scenario fits what's become known as the infirmity hypothesis. It was sort of made famous by Jim Corbett, famous animal control officer in colonial India, who hunted and killed many tigers and leopards in India that had killed hundreds of people. And what he's consistently found was that these cats that go after people are either old and have arthritis, they're incapacitated by shotgun wounds, they have broken teeth or claws, and occasionally are incapacitated by porcupine quills. But all of these things would have made a lion or a leopard or a tiger physically unable to pursue, subdue, or consume their normal prey, and cause shifts in diet where they go after easier prey, and people are a lot easier to bring down than large ungulates. And the first Tsavo lion clearly meets this requirement. Next slide. But there are a number of alternative hypotheses for the events that happened in Tsavo, and the most important ones, these are both environmental triggers for the man-eating events. The first is that we know from colonial records that 1897 and 1898 Kenya experienced a severe 2-year drought. Tsavo is a dry place anyway, but there was no rain for 2 years. And this led to widespread mortality of both humans and livestock. Further, in 1898, a rinderpest epidemic broke out. A rinderpest is an Asiatic disease that attacks bovids particularly virulently. It spread through the dwindling supplies of water that were left and further decimated hoof stock. And this drought and the ensuing chaos mortality it caused in humans and livestock would have initially been a positive for lions, who are, as everyone knows, facultative scavengers, but they would have soon needed alternative prey. Next slide. Now, the other leading environmental hypothesis is slave caravans. And to understand the relationship here, you need to understand that the railroad was following the shortest route possible between permanent water sources. And this same route had been used for 1,000 years by Arab caravans seeking ivory in the interior of Africa and using slaves to transport the ivory from Central Africa to the coast, and at the coast selling both the white gold, the ivory, and the black gold, the slaves, to the Indian Ocean slave market, chiefly the Arabian Peninsula. Now, of course, these slaves are treated horribly, and dead and dying slaves would have been abandoned along the trail because the caravan has no resupply of water and can't wait between these permanent water sources for sick or dying slaves to keep up. And resident carnivores along this trail would have been treated to a steady supply of scavenging opportunities. So these alternative hypotheses both rely on scavenging. Next one. So our predictions from the man-eating hypotheses are that under the infirmity theory, lions should exhibit severe incapacitation, and there certainly was a debilitating tooth abscess in the first man-eater. Now, under the environmental triggers, lions would turn to man-eating after scavenging under both the rinderpest drought and the slave caravan scenarios. We have evidence for the first. We need to seek evidence for the second. Next slide. That's where Larissa DeSantis entered the picture. Larissa is a paleobiologist at Vanderbilt University who uses patterns in modern carnivorans to understand their fossil and extinct relatives. And Larissa uses a technique called dental microwear texture analysis, which quantifies the surface of enamel using a scale-sensitive fractal analysis. So she takes impressions of teeth from museum specimens, subjects it to, scans the surface of those molds, and is able to clarify the textural properties of the foods that are consumed by the patterns shown in the enamel of the tooth. And when she approached me about this project, she said that she had already done work with feliform carnivorans that primarily eat flesh, like cheetahs, and had patterns that distinguish them from both generalists, like lions, and hyenas, who are particularly adept at fully consuming carcasses, including bone, so durophagy writ large. Next slide. And just to give you an impression of the kinds of things that are being measured by this analysis, complexity shown in the upper graph distinguishes taxa that consume brittle foods from taxa that consume softer ones. So a wide variety of patterns is indicative of brittle foods. Anisotropy gauges the degree to which the features of the enamel share similar orientations. And in that case, it's produced often by tough foods when the values of anisotropy are high. And finally, using algorithms to measure fitting the holes in the surface with blocks of different size, there's textural fill volume, and high values indicate many deep features in the tooth. Next. And when we do this for the lions, we come up with a very interesting pattern here. Hyenas, which are shown here in open squares and diamonds, are way out here in the complexity end of things, highly brittle foods, as you would expect, with lots of bone cracking. Cheetahs, on the other hand, who never crack bone and are meat specialists have very high toughness values and very low complexity. So they're in this area. Lions, because they're generalists, exhibit all of these patterns. Some lions crack bones, other lions are limited, and these tend to be the dominant and male lions who get the first bite off a carcass, have high toughness but low complexity. But the two 𝒂𝒊 man-eaters have low complexity and low toughness. And in fact, when we compare them to zoo lions, they're very close to that. And so the evidence that we have from dental enamel is that the man-eaters were not scavengers. They were not in desperate shape when they entered the camps at 𝒂𝒊. They were well-conditioned, and this is borne out by Patterson's account as well, that these were lions in their prime and not nearly the desperate lions that we would come to expect from either the scavenging hypotheses. So we have no support for environmental triggers for man-eating from this dental microwear texture analysis. Next slide. So the last set of questions, which relate to how many people the lions actually ate, revolves around this transparent point: you are what you eat. And when it comes to carbon, 99% of all carbon molecules have 6 protons and 6 neutrons, C12. About 1% have a 7th neutron, and they're heavier but stable. And then a very small fraction have 8 neutrons. That's carbon-14. That's the radiocarbon that's used in dating. And we can distinguish between these different carbons using a mass spectrometer. Next. Now, it's probably unnecessary to review photosynthesis for this crowd, but plants are good at taking carbon dioxide and water, and with the sun's energy, translating that into plant tissues and oxygen. Next. And most plants do this in a single step and produce a 3-carbon product, and so we call them C3 plants. And the enzyme that's involved in this strongly discriminates against the 1% of carbon molecules that have an additional proton, a neutron. So C3 plant tissues have much less C13 than the atmosphere. Next. But in many grasses, there are 2 steps that lead to a 4-carbon product. So these are the C4 plants. And the first enzyme that's involved hardly discriminates against C13 at all. So plant tissues incorporate C13 much closer to the atmospheric isotopic ratios. Next. And this carries through food webs. And so on the left side, we've got C3 plants. The atmospheric levels are about 6.5% negative. These are way negative, so -20, -25%. Down here, trees, shrubs, and browsers pick up that same signature from their foodstuffs. On the other hand, C4 grasses, again, they're much closer to atmospheric levels of C13, and the delta 13 is reflected in things that eat grass, the grazers, buffalo, zebra, etc. So next. So I need to credit Justin Yeckel, who was a graduate student at UC Santa Cruz at the time and is now a professor at UC Merced, for the great idea that emerged from some unpublished studies he'd done on lions in different parts of Africa. And what he produced here is evidence that wherever you find lions, they're eating grazers. Only in this one case involving 𝐞-𝐣𝐚𝐦 was there any evidence that they were even going after mixed feeders. And so lions are plains animals. They love grazers, and this includes zebra and wildebeest and buffalo and all those things that are out there eating grass. But the important thing for our story is that people don't eat grass. And any lion eating people would have a C3 anomaly in its tissues. And the size of that C3 anomaly could be used to estimate the number of people the lion had eaten. And so we began this study to put together what's needed to go after this story. Next. So the first order of business was to define a sampling frame of reference. And the 𝑳𝒊𝒏𝒔 Bridge lies right at the intersection of 𝑳𝒊𝒏𝒔 East and 𝑳𝒊𝒏𝒔 West. These two national parks together total 20,000 square kilometers. So it's a very big area. It includes a lot of habitat complexity. In general, 𝑳𝒊𝒏𝒔 East is dry and open, and 𝑳𝒊𝒏𝒔 West is wetter and more closed, more woodland than desert scrub. And so the browsers and grazers from these two areas have slightly different nitrogen and carbon isotope values. Next. We were also very fortunate to have a contemporaneous human reference. The Taita people live in the 𝑳𝒊𝒏𝒔 area within 30 kilometers of the 𝑳𝒊𝒏𝒔 Bridge. And they have a strange burial practice. They inter a body after death, and after a year or two, will disinter the head, which is cleaned off and placed in with a rock overhang, a cranial display niche. And I've seen these in the Taita Hills, and one with 23 human skulls lined up. And these are family, they're sort of clan-specific niches. And people go out to these and pray for when to plant their maize, when the rains will come. Big life decisions are made with the consultation of ancestors. And it seems very clear that in the wake of all the mortality, some at the time of the 𝑳𝒊𝒏𝒔 attacks, that some of these lineages went completely extinct. And Louis Leakey, when he was a graduate student at Cambridge, took a collection of these skulls back to the Duckworth labs at the University of Cambridge, England. And we had samples of these skulls for our analysis. So next. So the next order of business was to get some lions on this graph. And we had modern lions from 𝑳𝒊𝒏𝒔 from my field work there, and like lions everywhere else, they're eating grazers. And we had next boned samples of the two man-eaters. And what impressed us in this picture is that they were quite dissimilar from one another. One showed slight tendency to mixed feeding side of typical lions outside the limits of this group. The other, and this is the one with bad teeth, showed a marked departure towards what we would expect with the C3 anomaly was particularly strong in this lion. Next. But bone records diet over years and years of life. And what we wanted was a more sensitive measure of the lion's behavior during this final 9 months of their lives. And that signature could be found in hair, which is, as everyone knows, molted and regrown and reflects a much shorter episode of time. And so we analyzed the tail tufts of the two man-eaters, and those tail tufts are shown in black circles on this graph, whereas the bone samples show isotopic ratios generated from bone. And you can see that in this final period of 6 to 9 months, the first man-eater shows a massive shift in the direction of a C3 anomaly, whereas the other lion shows relatively little. Next slide. When we put these into Bayesian models to identify the source of different contributions, and the colors in this in figure B correspond with the colors of the different groups shown in figure A. Focus particularly on the green, you can see that there's relatively small components of green of people in the bone or hair of 969, but very strong, especially in the hair samples, very strong indications that this was an important contribution to the diet of the first man-eater especially. Next. So plugging in realistic estimates of how much food a lion needs per day, how much food the lions would have been able to harvest from their victims in Tsavo before dawn, when search parties would go out to bring back the remains. We estimated from these analyses that about 35 human victims were represented in the samples, not 135 as Patterson had claimed. And most of those 35 victims, approximately, about 28 were consumed by the first man-eater, and the second one may have consumed a quarter that much. Now, the claims were, Patterson in his book, The Man-Eaters of Tsavo, claimed that the lions killed 28 railway workers and scores of unfortunate Africans. He later, and this is a pamphlet that he wrote after selling the lions to the Field Museum, where he asserted in this that they ate 135 railway workers, native Africans. And so this has become the story of the Tsavo lions. And yet, when we look at the official history of the Kenya-Uganda Railway, the permanent way, a really authoritative account of the history of this railroad, 28 railway workers' families were paid compensation for their deaths at Tsavo. And so Patterson's claim that scores of unfortunate Africans totaled 107, or whatever the difference is there, were just pure fiction and sensationalism. It's kept his book in print ever since. Next slide. So I want to return here to the value of specimens and observe that the incidents at Tsavo spawned a century of speculations and wild conjectures about what took place there and why. And it also goes without saying that the two Tsavo man-eaters have been dead for 120 years and spent a quarter of a century as trophy rugs on the floor of an English cottage. Yet, even with these imperfect specimens, science can tell us about their health while alive. We've got evidence from root tip abscesses and their dental incapacitation, the diet, the C3 anomalies in their tissues, telling us how many victims they took, and even behavior, the dominance and asymmetrical access to food resources that would accompany a 400-pound lion sitting on a human carcass that's only 150 pounds, 70 kilograms in size. And I worked with a diet of lions in Tsavo that had the same asymmetry in dominance relationships where Kovotchi always ate first and he always mated first. And his partner was left on his own to follow. So every natural history museum is full of specimens with stories to tell, and not all of them involved imperial history and colonial Britain. Most of our specimens tell us about phylogeny, they tell us about diets, they tell us about all sorts of things, and their potential to tell us more than they've told us in the past is limited only by our imaginations and our access to the resources needed to get at those. Next. So you're almost welcome to come and see the lions and 40 million other specimens and artifacts in Chicago. If when COVID's over, we can all get back to normal. And I'd be happy next to take any questions that you might have. Next.
Okay, Bruce, I think that's it. It's been really a pleasure.
Thank you so much. And I apologize to everyone for subjecting you to an hour of English, but I'm sure you could understand it better than if I had tried to deliver it in Spanish.
It was great. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.